and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Suzanne Wunz. I'm the Executive Director at the Harvard Law School Library. And in addition to our authors and panelists, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and giving your time here to speak. I'd also like to thank the Dean's Office for providing today's refreshments. And June Casey in the back there, I'd like to thank June for coordinating today's event, which is a conversation about Volume 2 in the Helping Traumatized Children Learn series, creating and advocating for trauma-sensitive schools. And we have a lot of speakers, so I'm going to just hand it right over to Michael Gregory, Assistant Clinical Professor of Law here at HLS, to get us started.
Thanks. I want to just start by thanking the library for hosting this event. You know, it's a great joy when you put as much time and effort into a project like this as we did to, at the end of it, be able to come and listen to beloved colleagues talk about the work that you've done. So we really appreciate the library giving us this opportunity. I also want to particularly thank June, who was so much help in putting this together. We really appreciate all of your support. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming and joining us today. I'm going to do three things before I turn it over to Susan to introduce our panelists. The first of those is to introduce the authors of this volume. Secondly, I want to say a few things about the substance of the book, actually of both books, Helping Traumatized Children Learn Volume 1 and Volume 2, to provide some context for the conversation that we'll have. And then finally, I want to make just a couple of additional points about things that we hope are significant about this volume. So first, to start with introducing our authors. Sitting next to me is Susan Cole. She's the lead author of both volumes and also is the director of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative and of our clinic here at HLS, the Education Law Clinic. Susan began the work that would lead to these two volumes at Massachusetts Advocates for Children in the mid-1990s, and then brought the work to Harvard Law School in 2004 when Mac and Harvard joined forces to create the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, or TLPI, the mission of which, as we'll talk about today, is to ensure that children who have been traumatized by exposure to violence and other adverse childhood experiences succeed in school. Susan is also a former special education teacher. She taught in the Watertown Public Schools here in Massachusetts for several years before she entered the legal profession. And then sitting next to Susan is Ann Eisner. She's the deputy director of TLPI. And she provided clinical services and advocated on behalf of families and children who had experienced domestic violence for many years before she began sort of the second half or second phase of her career and entered the field of policy advocacy. And she now leads much of the policy advocacy work that we do at TLPI. There's another author who will be joining us. He's actually in a school right now dealing with a crisis related to a student, and so he's detained, but he'll be joining us shortly. His name is Joe Restuccia. Joe, by training, is a school psychologist and has worked both in schools and in out-of-district settings for many years, developing programs for students who have social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. In addition to his experience working with individual children, Joe also brings to our project knowledge and expertise in the field of organizational behavior. And so it's from Joe that we learn about how schools function, how schools operate, and the mechanisms for changing the culture in a school. And then there's me. I'm the fourth author on the book. And I had the great good fortune to join TLPI with the Skadden Fellowship when I graduated from law school in 2004, and have been here ever since, working with Susan in the Education Law Clinic, where our students represent families of children who have had traumatic experiences in the special education system, and also learn the skills of legislative lawyering by advocating at the Massachusetts State House. So we are your authors. Let me say briefly, just a few comments to summarize the contributions substantively that we've tried to make in these two volumes, Helping Traumatized Children Learn Volume 1 and 2. Basically, there are 5 core ideas that we've tried to communicate in these two volumes. Volume 1 sort of takes us up to 2.5, and then Volume 2 takes us the rest of the way. Let me share these 5 basic ideas. The first is that traumatic experiences are prevalent in the lives of children. By now, the research is abundantly clear that experiences like witnessing domestic violence, experiencing abuse and neglect, having a parent with a substance abuse or mental health issue, occur in the lives of children much more frequently than any of us would hope, and much more commonly than many of us had realized. This leads to the second idea, which is that the trauma response that can result from these experiences can have a profound impact on a child's development, and in particular, on a child's learning, behavior, and relationships in school. So a child's ability to process information and language, a child's ability to self-regulate his or her emotions, attention, and behavior, a child's ability to form trusting and effective relationships with adults and peers, are all things that can be affected by traumatic experience. The third point is that if schools become what we call trauma-sensitive learning environments, they can become communities for children that can buffer the impacts of these traumatic experiences and help students go on to become successful despite the adverse experiences that they may have occurred. In the first book, we got as far as coining the term trauma-sensitive schools and naming that this was something schools should strive to become. But it's in the second volume that we really define what a trauma-sensitive school is. And there are 6 attributes that we say make up a trauma-sensitive school. I'm not going to share those 6 attributes with you. You've got to read the book. But I assure you they're very good. So you should all take a look. The fourth point, the fourth basic idea that we've tried to communicate is that for schools to come to embody these 6 attributes requires a whole school process, a whole school effort. Becoming trauma sensitive isn't about identifying the kids who have had traumatic experiences, pulling them out of the classroom and sending them down the hall to some special service or intervention. It's about schools creating a whole school culture where every child feels safe and supported. The fifth and final idea is that in order for schools to do this, to engage in this whole school culture change, requires that we make trauma sensitivity a major focus of education reform. And so in our project, we advocate for laws and policies to set the conditions that will allow schools to become urgent about the issue of trauma sensitivity and engage in a process to make their schools safe and supportive. That's a basic summary of what we've tried to accomplish substantively in these 2 volumes. 2 final points, and then I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who will introduce our panelists and get the conversation going. One is to comment on the interdisciplinary nature of this work. It took 2 lawyers and a social worker and a school psychologist working together to have something to say about an institution that's as complex as our public schools. We have to work in interdisciplinary ways, and we hope that this volume stands as an example of good interdisciplinary work. The final point is that what we've also tried to accomplish here is a form of scholarship that blends and marries the best of what theory has to offer. And this is a book that's heavily grounded in theory with lots of footnotes at the back that are, we hope, impeccably done. But to marry that theory with the work of real educators working on the ground. We understand that in order to be helpful to schools, we can't just throw more theory at them. We have to really understand how schools work and how they can employ good theory. And so we hope that this is a contribution that does that. We'll let our panelists tell us whether we've succeeded or not. With that, I'm just going to again say thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan to introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone. In the interest of moving as fast as we can, we want to introduce the panelists, but I really want people to understand how important these people have been to our work and our effort and to these 2 books. None of it could have been written without them. As Mike said, this has to be an interdisciplinary effort. If we're going to create whole school change, we need everybody. We need consensus, and we need to work together. So first, I'm going to start with the first person who had a major influence on us, and this is Betsy McAllister Groves, who is director of the Child Advocacy Strand and a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But in a prior life, she was the founder and director of the Child Witness to Violence program at the Boston Medical Center. And in that role, she was a major groundbreaker in helping us understand the impact that domestic violence was having on children. And she helped us understand that these children we were representing in suspension and expulsion hearings really were engaging in traumatized behavior, and that we needed to do something about it. And she has guided us all the way through, helping us understand that it's not about a bunch of services, but a whole school environment. And the next person who came to us out of, you were in, I think, Arkansas or Iowa? Nebraska. And she came to Boston. One of the, sorry. Is Mary Beth Curtis. She's the director for the Center on Special Education at Lesley University. And she is a nationally known expert on reading and other areas of education. And she has brought all that experience to us. And to say we're the authors, it's true on paper, but she came when we needed her, when we ran into glitches, and said, Mary Beth, you're the only one who can solve some of these problems. And she would come and meet and edit, and we're very grateful to you. She'll tell you how she's now running a whole program on trauma sensitivity. I'll let her do that. Next to her is Dr. Sal Tarasi. He is the director of pupil personnel in Brockton, in the Brockton Public Schools. He has been just amazing at leading the effort across the entire district of Brockton to create school-wide trauma sensitivity across all the elementary schools so far, and as I understand, moving toward middle school and high school. So we're very honored to have him, and he, again, was a reader and made many contributions. Now, actually, the first person who came to us, even though I'm introducing her last, is Jaren Gatt. But I want you to know she's a graduate of this institution of Harvard Law School. She's a senior staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She is advocating for children and youth in the at-risk program there. But what is really important for you to know is that Jaren came to us just before she started law school and worked at Mass Advocates for Children. She was an intern at the Harvard Divinity School. And as an intern, I said to her, how'd you like to do some research on the impact of trauma on learning? I really think this is going to be about language development. And she took it away and did the lion's portion of the research on the Purple book, the first book, and the first solid draft that led us forward. So I'm going to turn it over. We'll just sit back and you can go in any order. I would, you know, if you want to go from in the order I introduced you, or however, we didn't talk about that.
That works.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you to the hosts and organizers of this event. This is really very, very exciting. And I think, as Susan was introducing us all, I was remembering back to the very, very early coalition meetings. Oh, I probably shouldn't even say how long ago that was. But the seeds of both of these books really coming out of this amazing group of practitioners that Susan and colleagues gathered together that I think from the beginning represented and celebrated the importance of cross-disciplinary work on this initiative. And I think this panel shows it, all of your work shows it, and it's part of the strength of the book. As Susan mentioned, I'm the former director of a program, the Child Witness to Violence Project at Boston Medical Center, which essentially is an outpatient mental health program for young children who've been affected by violence. And more recently, I have been working at the Ed School, continuing my focus and interest on traumatized children in particular, teaching a course there, and also working with a group to start a pilot child advocacy program. But I thought that what I wanted to do today was briefly to share with you two stories that I think in and of themselves, if anyone in this room, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if anyone doubts that there is a need for the kind of work and the kind of guidance that's being put out by these two books, I think this makes the case for that. So the first was a 6-year-old boy that we saw in our program some years ago, and he was in first grade in one of the schools actually in Somerville. And he was referred to us by his pediatrician, and the mom was very concerned about the impact of what she described as chronic domestic violence. It had ended. Her partner, the little boy's father, was out of the house. But it went on for many years, and it was the kind of, atmosphere of threat and occasional injury that really takes a pervasive toll on young children. So when we saw him, he had a number of symptoms that we knew could be connected to that trauma, the most pronounced of which were sleep disturbances. He also had some chronic anxiety about the safety of his family members. And this, of course, particularly the sleep stuff, reverberated into the school day. So we reached out to his teacher, which we do as a part of all of our evaluations, to ask about how he was doing in school. And she described him as chronically tired, falling asleep, and getting behind on his work. And as she talked about him, I could hear the note of frustration in her voice. And she said something like, I don't know what is going on in that home, and I don't know why this mom can't get him, why he can't get good sleep, but that's a basic to being able to function in the classroom. And I remember feeling stuck at that point because in my meetings with the mother, she was very clear in the fact that she did not want the school to know about the domestic violence. She was ashamed. She felt guilty at some level for having failed to protect her child in this way. And she frankly said, I don't want them to know about my business, and I don't want what was then DSS, now DCF, Child Protection Services, coming into my life. So I remember feeling stuck with that in some ways, because on the one hand, we had a teacher who was understandably frustrated and felt somewhat helpless at making sense out of why this child was chronically tired and falling behind. She didn't know the full story. She had no idea. So she made some assumptions or judgments based on what she saw, essentially. And then we had, on the other hand, the mom who didn't trust the school. So there was a disconnect between the child's experiences at home and his life at school. So that's story number one. Story number two comes from a training that I did very recently for the school psychologists and counselors in the Cambridge Public Schools. So there were about 40 of them, I think, gathered together. And the title of this training was Children, Traumatic Stress in Schools. And I should tell Susan and colleagues that I had this nice PowerPoint slide that showed your book. So I'm doing a little advertising as I go. But this is a very committed and experienced group of individuals. And I think things that I heard from them just brought me back. It's partly why I was so glad I had the slide of the book there. So the first thing one of the counselors raised was what she saw as the problem or the challenge of ed plans or behavior plans that were made in the school where she consulted that seemed punitive to her or somehow missed the mark of what might be helpful to the particular child involved. Again, because there seemed to be no room to consider or acknowledge the origin of the behavior. What was the meaning of this behavior? How did it serve the student? What was its function? And I think if you can't, so this bothered her a lot, and she was wondering about how you could begin to connect the dots here, because she knew what was going on with this child at home, same as my first story. And so she told that story, and then we had a story, a particular one by another psychologist, who told a story about working with a teacher who felt particularly frustrated and angry at times with the student in her class who was challenging her at every stage of the game. And she finally proposed to the school that the student be moved out of her class. There was some pushback about this for many reasons in the school, but the counselor who worked with the teacher, and she was able to get some time with the teacher alone, spoke about how defeated this teacher felt, and at some level how guilty she felt and how alone with these feelings of frustration. She said there was no space in her day to reflect on how to work differently with the student. She didn't have the space to step back to even try to figure out why it was that she was so frustrated with the student. And there was no space to problem solve with another professional, no space to even acknowledge this except with his counselor. So what do these stories have in common? I think that they both raise issues about the challenges of recognizing and intervening with children affected by trauma. But I think at a deeper level, they're also asking the question about how you create a community within a school, a community of learners and educators and parents who feel safe in sharing information. And whether it's the information that the parent might or might not want to share with the school, or the information or the feelings that the teacher had about what it was like to work with this really challenging student. And so I think this becomes kind of a personal segue and a testimonial about this book. Because, and I'm going to close this by reading you their description, which can be found on page 18, that begins their chapter on a vision for a trauma-sensitive school. Quote, a trauma-sensitive school is one in which all students feel safe, welcomed, and supported, and where addressing trauma's impact on learning on a school-wide basis is at the center of its educational mission. It is a place where an ongoing inquiry-based process allows for the necessary teamwork, coordination, creativity, and sharing of responsibility for all students, and where continuous learning is for educators as well as students. So I think and hope that this speaks for itself about my perceptions of the importance of the book and my excitement about the fact that so many school systems will have an opportunity to begin to implement some of these policies. Thank you.
Just move on. Hello, everyone. I want to add my thanks for this event and for the work of this team, and it's great to be here. I did come from Nebraska. Formerly, I spent 10 years out there in Nebraska working for an organization called Boys Town. And when I came to Lesley University as the director of the Center for Special Education, I was called into MAC to talk about reading disabilities and what to do about students with reading disabilities. And as we got into a conversation about reading disabilities with Susan and her colleagues at MAC, we began to talk about disproportionate representation and how it was sort of a chicken and an egg problem. Did somebody have difficulty learning to read because they weren't given the opportunity, because they had some kind of behavioral issue that was going on, or was the behavioral issue a consequence of not getting a chance to learn how to read? And so that really formed the context for Lesley University's interest in this topic. As you know, I hope, we're located down the street, and we do a lot of teacher preparation. And as Betsy was talking, I was thinking that teacher really hadn't been prepared well enough to deal with the students that were in her classroom. So in some senses, she was very well-intentioned in Joe Restuccio's terms, but she didn't have the knowledge and skills and predispositions that she needed in order to help this student. So it was really from those two perspectives that Lesley started to get involved in this issue. One, that there are many students who are ending up in the special ed population, not because they don't have special needs. They do have special needs, but they're bringing in challenges from home that are causing difficulty within the classroom. It's not a mismatch between the kind of instruction that's going on and what they can benefit from. And the second thing is that if you look at the teacher preparation regulations, there's really nothing in there at all about how we can help children like this. And so in the early days of working with TLPI on this, we got groups together to talk about what teachers need to know and how we were going to get them that information. And it was wonderful. We had people from all over the state. Betsy was at some of those meetings. And if you know anything at all about MAC, they know how to get policy changes going. And so we were gung-ho when we were going to change those teacher regulations to make sure that trauma was built in there, until all of a sudden we said, well, wait a minute. Is that really going to help? So let's step back a little bit and think about that. And so then we started to do professional development, and the professional development was really, the Purple Book was at the core of that professional development. We started with a few districts, we gave some Saturday workshops on them, and we discovered a couple of things from that. The first thing was that it's best when you do this kind of training together in teams. Individuals attending by themselves go back to their schools and they only become more frustrated because they don't have the team that they need to work with it on. And the other thing is that in order to change a teacher's knowledge and skills and dispositions about this, you really have to have a little bit of Velcro up there. And that Velcro really comes from experience with these children in the classroom. We can't really do it very well in a pre-service where people haven't had any clinical experience at all to map onto. So for me, that's one of many big ideas that come out of this book. The big idea is that it's not about training individual people. It's about creating a culture in which those individuals can now come together as a team and figure out what needs to be in place. It's about creating and advocating for trauma-sensitive schools, but it's also about sustaining those schools as well. And I think that's going to be volume 3, but I'll wait. You know, I don't want to scoop them. The second big idea that I think comes out of this work has to do with the way in which the content is put together. I had the privilege of reading some early drafts, and it was just amazing. I would come into these meetings and I would say, I'm just overwhelmed with all the questions. If you're familiar with the book, there are trauma-sensitive vision questions. There are flexible framework questions. There are process questions. There are staff survey questions. There are questions for analyzing the results from the staff survey. There are questions to guide you in assessing your progress towards becoming trauma sensitive. And I felt at times, and most of you are too young to get this reference, but there were more questions in here than the Baltimore Catechism had questions. And if you don't get it, just Google it, and you'll understand it. But as we talked more about it, I began to realize that the reason that there were so many questions is that this is an issue where one size is not going to fit all. And in education, we tend to be so product solution oriented. If we can buy a program, we're really happy to do that. And what this work is telling us is that a program, a single program, is not going to solve this problem for us. We really have to think about what our situation requires, what our students require, what our teachers require, what our administrators require, what our system requires, what our community requires. And that's why there are so many questions in this book. It's about inquiry. It's about a process-oriented guided inquiry, and that's what the book does. Again, it tells you how to create and advocate through that process-oriented inquiry. The third big idea, and I'll stop with 3, has to do with universal design. Again, another big concept in education right now. I don't know how many of you are familiar with universal design. The notion comes out of architecture, and that is that what you want to do is eliminate barriers for people before they encounter them. So you'll walk along Mass Ave and you'll see the curb cuts there. The curb cuts are there so that people with wheelchairs can cross the street. And yet how many of us use those curb cuts every day with strollers, with rollerboard suitcases, with our bicycles? I use it with my skateboard. There are just so many of us that use those curb cuts. Same thing with closed captioning TV. Closed captioning TV originally was there to serve one element of the population, and now in bars and gymnasiums all over the country, people are utilizing it. So when we remove barriers for some, it ends up benefiting all. And I think, again, that's what this book is saying. Trauma-sensitive schools are good not only for those children that Betsy was talking about, but it's good for all kids. And again, I would just reference a few things that are here. And as part of the trauma-sensitive vision questions, schools are asked to figure out how they can effectively support all students to feel safe, physically, socially, emotionally, and academically. How can we explicitly connect all students to the school community and provide them with multiple opportunities to practice newly developed skills throughout school? How can we support staff's capacity to work together as a team with a sense of shared responsibility for every student? I mean, who wouldn't thrive? Children, teachers, administrators, school board members, the community, if we could look at all these questions for all children. So as Susan said, Leslie has been developing coursework. We have 3 courses. We've been doing it under the guidance and the leadership of Joe, who's just joined us, and I hope everything resolved itself all right. He's smiling. You can never tell whether it did because he always smiles. And Sal Tarasi has been helping us. We've been piloting these programs down in Brockton. There are 3 courses in the sequence, and we're now at the point where we're really beginning to move it out and implement it wider throughout school districts. And so we'd be more than happy to tell you more about those courses and the kind of data that we've been gathering on them.
Any questions? When you said Baltimore Catechism, I got such a flashback. I'm not sure I'll be able to speak. I still have mine, though.
Oh, do you?
Speaking from the viewpoint of a public school administrator, I can tell you that both books, they fill a gap that is particularly helpful to public school educators, because by and large, in the K-12 system, you're not set up to do research, and you don't have a terrific lot of training in reading research, reading, peer-reviewed scholarly publications at that level. And so, you sort of know what you need, you know what resonates with you, and this issue, I can assure you, resonates with public school teachers, and I'll give some examples. But you're not going to get it by reading the primary source material like the ACEs study and things like that. So a publication that can take that kind of theoretical formulation and that kind of primary research, and then package it in a way that makes it not only interesting and raises the awareness of educators, but makes it actionable in some way, is indeed a very, very valuable resource. And so I thank the authors for it, because I myself have seen the way that it has, the issue has resonated with people, and the way it has been nothing short of a springboard to our own actions, which I'd like to talk about today. We in the Brockton Public Schools have been involved in this issue, specifically using the trauma-sensitive schools approach since now about 2007, and it really it came to my attention in some ways through the work of Betsy with our district attorney's office. Brockton Public Schools works very, very closely with the DA's office, the local DA's office, and it's a nice marriage, because the contact person that we work with is not only knowledgeable about law enforcement, but is himself a trained social worker, MSW. And so, he gets it, and he came to me and said, I have something I want to make you aware of. Do you think we could do something with it? And what we did back in the fall of 2007 was we put together a conference which at that point in time was nothing more than a one-shot deal. It was simply meant to test the waters, raise the level of awareness in the community, and we had basically no idea, at least I didn't. These folks probably did, but I didn't have any idea where we were going with it at that point in time. But I put together a conference at one of the local conference centers, which involved building level teams. So we did take the building level team approach. And we had an administrative, a principal or assistant principal, along with the school counselor. We do have the luxury of having adjustment counselors in all of our buildings. So we had a counselor, we had a nurse, as I said, an administrator, and then we from each one of our elementary schools, and then we invited community-based organizations like representatives from the Department of Children and Families, representatives from local counseling agencies. We had representatives from the police department there, and we had some speakers. We have a consulting child psychiatrist, and he spoke a little bit. Joe Restuccia, and I'm sure you'll hear from him in a little while. He made a presentation, and I happened to be, as sort of the MC, I would introduce people and then go stand off to the side. So I happened to be standing in the rear of the room by the door next to our superintendent, who came by to sort of see what was going on. And his eyes got as big as silver dollars, and he turned to me halfway through Joe's presentation and he said, "This explains so much about what I've been through and what my family had been through." This is a gentleman who had Mongolian by birth, had been displaced out of, the family had been displaced out of their homeland. He spent a good portion of his youth in refugee camps in Europe. And he said, this explains so many of the things that have happened in my life. This explains, he talked about his brother to me while we were standing there, his sister and what had happened to them and that sort of thing. And I think that what we have seen is that this way of looking at children is an alternative to the typical sort of behavior dash consequences, typical school discipline. And so rather than viewing school discipline or viewing children's actions, as we often do in schools, as willful misbehavior, it gives us an alternate perspective which simply works a lot better. And after the conference, I had teachers coming up to me and saying, I have children just like that in my class. And so when I say the issue resonated with us, that's exactly what I mean. And people were calling then upon me in my administrative capacity to, what do we do next? We need more of this. We want more of this. That is not always what happens when you have, in public schools, when you have what is typically a one-shot professional development, sort of what I sometimes inappropriately refer to as a drive-by professional development experience. It was an issue that had traction. And so what we did was consulted with the people from the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. We initially applied for a Department of Education grant, and one of our schools had ran professional development all summer. They trained every teacher in the school in sort of a summer session, we collaborated with TLPI to do that, and Joe came out and did some training, and we had some other things going on. And we began to see when teachers were putting this into action at the school level, all of a sudden there was a different school climate. And to the extent that schools will keep data in a rigorous way, which is, as I say, we're not typically set up to do research, but we're getting a lot of information early on that office referrals are decreasing. Behavior on the playground is better. Suspensions are dropping. And some kinds of key indicators that mean a lot to public school administrators are beginning to change. And then, of course, word gets around, and other principals, want to be in on that. So we tried to then develop a collaboration with Mary Beth and Leslie in terms of, well, if we were to develop some courses, would we be able to offer those courses in a sequential manner, ultimately leading to some sort of trauma-sensitive certificate program or something like that? And at this point in time, we actually have 3 courses. In my district alone, now it's a fairly large district, it's not as large as Boston, but it is 17,000 students. So it's a fairly large urban district. We have about, we've offered the course number 1, which is kind of an overview of the issue, to about 265, 270 people. And out of the teachers that have taken the first course, we have about another 50 or so that have taken the second course, and we're just wrapping up course number 3.
Yeah,
so we've offered to a much smaller group the third course, and so we have, we've done about 300 individual graduate level courses, and I don't mean to imply by any stretch of the imagination that we see ourselves as really accomplished in this. I think we've made a very, very good beginning, to the point where I now have other districts calling me saying, what can we do? And so we're now thinking about ways to maybe bring this a little bit more broadly across the state. And so, Reading has done some work. Worcester is very interested in doing some work. I had a conference call yesterday with people from Newburyport. So it is an idea that is gaining a lot of momentum, and I think that sort of now dovetails with one of the other things we learned from the book, which is the policy aspect of this. Again, in public education, at the teacher level, there is not, teachers sort of work with their children. They close the door, they do the best they can, they work within the building, they might try to use the resources of the district, but they don't typically think in terms of higher level policy stuff. And that's something also that we've learned from the book, that there is another layer to all of this. And so we've begun to do some work at the policy level, and some of myself, but more importantly, some of our building leaders and principals have actually given testimony at hearings of the committees at the legislature. And so we're also working to some extent on the policy level. Sort of to sum things up, in the final analysis, when we see that different fields of endeavor, different areas of research are basically converging with the same information, you really do have to stand up and take notice. So, out at Stanford, and Carol Dweck's work with the recent book Mindsets, and the importance of school culture and climate, or Angela Duckworth at UPenn, and her work with grit and perseverance. But she always seems to couple that with the need for a supportive school environment to make that happen. Or with what we see from the brain-based researchers in terms of children simply not being available for executive function, higher level cognitive learning of novel academic material, if much of their psychological energy is going to keep them safe, because they're always in a hypervigilant state, and they're trying to attend to their own safety, well, then they don't have much left over for learning. So when you see all of these things coming together, and then sort of so nicely presented, as we have in both of the TLPI books, it really does give us an opportunity to take the next step, and that's sort of what we're doing now, is taking the next step. I certainly don't want to speak for everybody on the panel, but if there are questions, I'm sure that would be a good use of our time also. So thank you.
I want to add one thing. The work that Leslie's doing, and I know also the work that TLPI is doing, is very generously funded by the Oak Foundation. So they have been putting scholarship money there for us to enable teachers in Brockton and the various districts to participate in the courses. You'll probably want to say something about them toward the end as well, but I wanted to acknowledge them.
Thank you. Just one other thing, when Mary Beth referenced universal design and the curb cuts and architectural, I can attest to the fact, the level to which we have seen that sort of thing work in public schools, not only because of the architecture, but doing training in sort of the education of students with disabilities, in that the same techniques that are effective oftentimes with students who have certain disabilities benefit all children. We see it in bilingual education, that the same type of approaches that are good and effective with English language learners also benefit other children in the classroom. So this concept of universal design is something that really is, I think, represents the future. I have a particular interest in testing and assessment, and that's sort of in what my training is. And I wish that we would move more toward universal design in assessment and testing, because it would address so many of the issues that we have with accommodations and alternate assessment and those sorts of things. So there is a substrate here of things that are applicable widely across the board, and in many ways represent, I think, the future of education.
Hi, I'm Jaren Gad, and I am here as a practitioner, but also as an alum. So I want to thank everyone, particularly my colleagues, for their leadership. This has really been an extraordinary, thinking back to how long it was ago that we started without quantifying. It really has been an extraordinary journey, and they've shown a lot of leadership. And the thing, before I discuss sort of the practical aspects of the application of this work, the one thing that I would note for the students in the room is that the work on increasing awareness of trauma and the model of social change and how you bring forward the issue and then develop policy responses and use it in litigation, that it is an excellent model of social change for those of you who are studying and trying to think deeply about systemic change and how the tools that you use to be effective in that. And so I would encourage you, to reach out to the people who are here, because they have an incredible insight that they can offer to you, irrespective of what your particular substantive interests are. So on the practical side, I think the awareness of trauma is something that, in representing children, there are a number of places that it comes to play. And the reason that that is important is because as lawyers, whether we're doing individual case advocacy or impact litigation, there are ways that we can plug into the larger coalition to make people aware of trauma and help schools actually become more trauma sensitive as they undertake the efforts that you have talked about and I think are being implemented elsewhere throughout the country. So I want to talk briefly, just to give you a couple of examples of ways that in individual advocacy, the issues and the challenges faced by traumatized children particularly the research that is outlined both in the Purple Book and extended into the Teal Book, volumes 1 and 2, that there are places where you can use this as you're representing children. And one of these, the sort of cluster, is when you're representing a child who is affected by school discipline policies. And Sal mentioned, this prevailing model of discipline that's behavior and consequences, but without fully understanding what leads to the behavior, the consequences could not follow in any logical way and tend to re-traumatize children. So I would note things like codes of conduct. A lot of the codes of conduct that you will be in representing kids, particularly when they are subject to potential expulsion or suspension, looking at how the codes of conduct actually define what are offenses and what is the process that's outlined for school discipline. Another big issue where I think a trauma lens really clarifies the challenges that are faced, particularly by school officials, is in the area of the use of school resource officers, which are police officers in schools. And so particularly in Alabama, there are school resource officers in most of the schools. And there's an increasing incidence of children just getting in fights. You think about particularly teenage kids getting in fights and that leading to actual arrests. And a willingness because there is this culture of wanting to make sure that schools are safe, which is sort of a different understanding of what a safe school means. A willingness on the part of administrators to defer to school resource officers. And this is where I think, to the extent that lawyers can actually help school officials, who I think many of whom want to do the right thing, but maybe, sort of torn between, public pressure or pressure from a school district level, to help in a school-wide setting and from a school-wide perspective to understand. If you have a trauma-sensitive school, your first response is not going to be to allow the school resource officer to go and arrest a child. There's going back to the questions, there would be a whole series of questions and discussions that would precede that very significant moment of arrest, because once a child is arrested, we know a lot of things happen. You can, the school to prison pipeline is not something which I imagine most of you are unfamiliar. But that one particular area, the relationship between school officials and school resource officers, is something that is, I think, a critical point. And as a lawyer, when you're representing a child, that is where, once that encounter occurs, that's when you are going to get involved. So advocacy on behalf of schools, especially if you are a GAL or a lawyer with you're a repeat player in the system, I think your ability to become familiar with the research on trauma and its effects and educate people in that setting and partner with school officials who actually already understand trauma and what it can do to kids, I think it can be a mutually reinforcing relationship that's very effective. Obviously, individual representation of children in suspension and expulsion proceedings, being able as a lawyer to marshal not only the potential expert testimony, but the research that's out there, and making sure that you build fact records in a way that would allow you to argue and integrate those two, so that you're telling a more complete story of the child, so that then whoever is the fact finder and then potentially on appeal, that information can be used. And the analogy that I would offer you is the way that you would represent a criminal defendant at a sentencing hearing. And I don't know what the level of background is. Once a person is found guilty of an offense, there's usually a sentencing hearing, and there's this process called mitigation. And in mitigation phase of a trial, you basically offer all of the factors about the person that would be relevant to a determination of what their sentence should be. And you can use if you have built your record, you can use the same kind of legal process and fact-finding and evidence and expert testimony in suspension and expulsion proceedings to illuminate the way that a child who has been traumatized, how their behavior, you might see it very differently if you were adequately informed. And then being able to build that record is useful for the system, because it also educates all of the players in the legal system as you're building that record. In child welfare cases, dependency cases, children who have been allegedly abused or neglected or who are becoming dependent, using trauma so that those children, if in the event that they act out in response to their traumatic experiences and then are referred to, like what in Alabama is called the Department of Youth Services, which is the detention facilities. Using what you know about trauma and the research and the facts that you've developed in representing the child to determine whether that child has been rehabilitated and can be released, right, to get the services. In Alabama, there are two systems. There's the Department of Youth Services that deals with children who have been found delinquent, and then there is the Department of Mental Health that deals with the sort of therapeutic side, which has the care and custody of children who have been found dependent. So using trauma and trauma sensitivity, working with schools, because all of these service providers will fit into the course of your legal proceedings at various points, and advocating on behalf of children, enabling them to be in conversation in a more meaningful way and get much more constructive service provision for the children. Obviously, in the the juvenile justice system, at a transfer hearing, when a child has been arrested or taken into custody, and charged with offense, particularly where the offense is fairly serious, there will be what is called a transfer hearing, which is the judicial determination of whether the child should be dealt with either in the juvenile justice system or in the adult criminal justice system. That's an extraordinary determination because the protections, obviously, that are afforded to a child in the juvenile justice system are very, very different than what will be afforded to the child in the adult criminal justice system. And the long-term consequences of that decision are very significant. Using a trauma lens, and again, going back to things like using the scientific research that is out there, building expert testimony, building an appropriate factual record at that point, which is obviously subject to appeal in the event of an unfavorable decision, you're much more likely to be able to persuade the court that the appropriate place to deal with a child misconduct is in the juvenile court or juvenile justice system as opposed to the adult court system. And so these are just, and I don't want to belabor all of the potential places that this could come up, but I wanted to give you kind of a smattering and an idea of the ways that lawyers, in doing the things that we do on a daily basis, can help to increase people's awareness. And when I say people, I'm from the juvenile justice system, all agency service providers that are relevant to a child, are relevant in a child's life, but also as they work with schools, because children, when events happen, tend to go from their schools to other places. So by using your individual advocacy, or even if it's an impact case, using the same legal tools, you can increase awareness and enable these service providers to work together in a way that leads to better outcomes. So the other thing that I would say that I think is important, being in Alabama and outside of Massachusetts, where things are actually going very well, relatively speaking, in areas that are poor, the one thing I would say is that this approach that has been outlined both in with the flexible framework and then thinking about policies is a very efficient way for schools that don't have a lot of resources to be able to think very effectively about how they can multitask, combining initiatives and ways that improve children's overall competence while working together. You don't have to have a lot of money to be able to talk. It's very helpful if you can get some grant and support, obviously, for things like, having the administrator, and a number of the policies or steps that are outlined in Volume 2, I think would benefit from financial support. But it seems to me that schools can actually undertake what we're asking them to do from a whole school approach without having a lot of money. And I think that's very important in trying to sell it in terms to various stakeholders. And I would just say, to the extent that you are interested, this is an extraordinary issue that really does make a big difference in the life of children. And as a lawyer, that was something when I was in your shoes, is something that I wanted to do, and I would encourage you to kind of give this some more thought. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I'm sure we're past 1 o'clock, but I'm sure that we'd be happy to, if anybody wants to stick around and ask a question, I'm sure to the extent the panelists can remain for a few minutes, I think we can. We'd be happy to take any questions.
We want to introduce Joe Rastusha, who is the 4th author on the book, and you've heard his name many times about how influential he's been in this state, spreading the word.
Thank you all.
Yeah, you want to say that? No.
There are copies of both books for sale as well down here at the table.
Any questions? It's quiet. We'll eat up heartily.
Yeah.
Oh, question.
Here's a question.
Do you think that it would be feasible for
will address it to the extent that I can. If the principal is, it might work the other way. If the principal is not committed, it probably won't go too far. But if the principal is the only one committed, the principal's job is how do I achieve buy-in? How do I get other people to share my vision? That's sort of what principals are supposed to be doing. But I can tell you that there are things that, that can be done, that are not, do not cost a lot. For example, our child witness to violence. We now have the relationship with the police where we get phone calls from the police. Our director of guidance gets them. They come into my office, but they go specifically to the director of guidance. That when for example a house call is made that involves children. Now, we had to work out a lot of details about respecting confidentiality and those sort of things. But for example, the same information that will be published in the newspaper the next day in the police log indicating that there was an incident at such and such an address, we'll get that before it gets to the paper. We'll get that in the morning before school, and we will look up that address to see what children in what school. We'll look in our student information management system to see, what students are at that address and what school do they go to, and we can put in kind of a discrete call to the principal and the council in that building that, without specifics, that, if so-and-so in your building might be bringing something to school today in terms of, an issue that they're carrying with them. So, those kinds of things don't cost anything, and are easily done.
I'd also recommend that if resources are small, that you get together a group of people to read the book together and discuss both books together. We use them as text in the courses, and of course having Joe and his team of adjuncts is essential for getting most out of it and the action planning moving forward. But I think if you think about a flipped classroom, just sitting down and having people read these and discuss them, teacher, administrator, book club, yeah, it would be a great way to get started. Anybody that I've sent it to has asked for more copies to sit down with people in their school. So that would be one pretty inexpensive way to get going, I think.
And then if I could just jump on as the third one to piggyback on to answer your question. Within that context, the actions that take place within the school that represent this sort of shift in thinking, this cultural shift, if you look at them from the outside, they're really very small. Standing at the door to the classroom and greeting each child as they walk into the classroom in the morning. And so it's not so much that we need to be layering in more resources. The idea is to, through learning and learning together, whether it's professional learning communities, directed by leadership, is to begin to see the dynamic in the school in the context of trauma and the impact of trauma, and that create this trauma-sensitive environment. And then as we shift these little pieces of the day, as we allocate our resources and think about what we do, that shifts the culture and in fact has the effect that we would want to have, that frankly, and you can speak to it too, Sal, that sometimes bringing in hordes of therapists and hordes of outsiders to support, if the culture is a particular way and is not going to be receptive to it, you won't see the kinds of shifts. And again, I'm not saying don't do that. If you can do both, it's the best situation. But the resources you have can be used in a way that's much more effective in supporting students in feeling safe, settled, and provide the social emotional skill that makes them available to learn for the time in learning.
One of the things I learned from Joe, and this is a really inexpensive thing to do, every time you have a student who is having issues, if you ask yourself, what's the good intention underlying this behavior? It's a tough thing to do, but I mean, you want to assume that there is a good intention that's underlying and start to problem solve from there. And I've seen whole schools turn around just by thinking about that. That's a really cheap way.
Sorry.
So I have a question about, and you had alluded to the kind of sometimes the cultural differences between school resource officers and in schools in terms of how to approach these. And it seems to me that, do you bring the school resource officers into this kind of trauma-sensitive environment? Do you teach them? I mean, are they part of it so they understand their responsibility?
In our district, and this is the first year that we've done this, so I don't mean to overplay it, but for example, we've gone so far as to now bring this to the level of paraprofessionals. We've done a version, it's not a 3-credit graduate level course, but we've done a version of training in trauma-sensitive mentality with our paraprofessionals. And so that, yeah, school resource officers, cafeteria workers, it's all of a piece.
Nurses are the ones that see these kids the most often, in my experience.
When we speak whole school, it's everyone in that school. Resource officer, cafeteria workers, janitorial staff, professional staff, paraprofessional staff, administration.
Often report to someone different. Do you often get any kind of pushback there, or are they on board?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just not to oversimplify, yeah, there is oftentimes pushback. I mean, you know, you will hear things like, it's usually not so much, and that's why we, speaking personally, we've begun at the elementary level, because sometimes the secondary level introduces another set of challenges, like, I'm a chemistry teacher, not a mental health clinician. What do you want me to do? Kind of, I mean, that sort of thing. So I think that, not to downplay it, though resistance is part of the change process. And I don't want to deny that. Right.
There's just not a lot of oxygen left. How do you break through and really emphasize this?
I think there's a lot of good evidence, and you know, I'll attest to it, at least my personal opinion, that, you know, one of the outcomes, unintended probably, of you know, the sort of high stakes test accountability movement has been this sort of narrow-minded focus on, these are the learning standards, this is what children need to be able to know and do, to the exclusion of the other kinds of things that we're talking about today. And I recently, I don't have it with me now, but John Easton is an official in the Federal Department of Education, and in a publication from the Office of Technology, he's quoted as saying, we for too long now, because of the test accountability movement, have ignored what the soft or non-cognitive skills. And yeah, so there is that kind of pressure on, well, this is not in the standards, this is not going to be on the test. But the other side of that coin is, it's, number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, it does help children to become more whole and adaptive people, which should be part of our responsibility. And number three, in effect, it does make them available for learning, and ultimately should have some effect on their academic performance, but that wouldn't be the primary reason we should be doing it, but it ultimately will benefit learning.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there are oxygen-consuming and oxygen-generating initiatives, and oftentimes it's the ones that come from outside that are not aligned with my concerns in my classroom that consume the oxygen. We find consistently across schools we work in that we are identifying the issues that teachers are concerned about, but no one seems to want to talk about. And so we find that this work, when they hear it and they become aligned, they become excited. It creates oxygen. It creates initiative. And the fact that it's the small steps that can make a big difference, understanding the good intent, standing by the door, a number of very straightforward initiatives that teachers can take, empowers them. And so it's been my experience, not only in teaching of the courses, but in providing trainings in schools, that it generates oxygen. We're speaking to their concern. They're speaking to what they see with their students every day, as opposed to someone from the outside imposing standards that are not really relevant to what they're trying to accomplish in their classroom.
And I was going to say something very similar. I mean, I feel your pain, the professional development du jour effect, and people just, well, we'll wait it out and there'll be something different next year. What happens with this, I think, and Joe just spoke to it, you just get this aha. And everybody goes, wow, this explains so much and helps us reorganize all those other initiatives. It does take on a life of its own as soon as people go, wow, there's a reason that this kid is acting this way that I didn't recognize.
Thank you very much.
Is this filtered down into schools of ed? I mean, is this something you get,
Well, we're a school of education. I'd say it's filtered that far. It is, but it's interesting the qualifications for people who are good at doing this work. Our adjuncts are drawn from people who have worked through some of the notions that are in these books. It's not somebody who would have a PhD who just, came out of graduate school. You've got to have the stories. You've got to have the experiences. When you watch Joe teach and when you watch the adjuncts that he's mentored teach, it's always connecting to a particular situation. And so schools of education don't always like to employ those kinds of people, if I can put it frankly. They like people who have other kinds of credentials. So in order for it to be meaningful and have the impact we want it to have, it has to be the kind of adjunct and professor that has that kind of clinical experience.
You might want to speak to it, Ann, a little bit. One of the things that we came to a realization that we needed to do was to have a committee and we happen to call it the Trauma Advisory Board, and it just has become known at that. And Joe occasionally attends and regularly attends. And many of the educators in our district attend, but we also bring in, sort of collateral agencies like DCF has a representative there. A couple of the counseling agencies have a representative there. The DA's office is there. We even have a school committee person who sits on that. And we view the mission of that particular committee, and I think it's in the mission statement, is really to attend to the well-being, the social and emotional well-being of all children in the community. So it's not merely or even primarily a school department initiative. One of the things we did this summer, for the first time, because we're just beginning to realize sort of what's helpful and what needs to be done, is we've done some cross-training. The school department ran professional development for outside agencies toward the end of developing a shared common language. So when children go from a school program to an after-school program, the after-school service providers are using the same system and the same language that the children are getting in school. So there is this aspect of wanting to have a community-wide approach. And I'd like to say we have it all figured out. We don't, but we're getting there a little bit. Yeah, I've had 42 years of experience with Brockton High School. Early in my career, I mean, that was the first place I worked, and I taught there. And then, now I'm sort of in the central office. But, I think there needs to be a recognition that it's not easy work. We have had a number of teachers from Brockton High School take the course, and Joe maybe can speak to that a little bit. And so, again, I won't say that Brockton High School has made a commitment to become a trauma-sensitive school. But, you know, groundwork is being laid, and, you know, we see this as, again, this is the work of time, changing the culture of a district or of a city. And, you know, quite frankly, it's a much easier thing to do at the elementary level. You know, I mean, you might have one teacher, the students are with that teacher for the majority of their subjects. You have it's different than in a high school where you have maybe each student coming into contact with 5 different content area specialists and that sort of thing. We're working on it, but it is not an easy sell. Anything to add?
No, and you know, there have been some folks from Brockton High School, a number of them that have taken courses. I've also done some work in unrelated schools in another part of my life, high schools. And if you think of, as you move from elementary school through high school, that the focus, the culture of that school moves from child-centered to, at a high school, very subject-specific. Even the way they organize the building, and you know, most buildings in terms of this is the ELA wing, this is the math wing, this is the science wing. And that, so that there are additional layers, if you will, of culture that really are misaligned in many ways with the needs of the child. And that what I've found in the work I've done with high school and the work I've done with the folks from Brockton High School is you go where there's reception. Because as they begin to implement and think this way and they begin to have success in their class, and suddenly their kids are in class and they're engaged, and they start talking more about the excitement of teaching rather than the harassment of trying to control student behavior, that other people start to take notice. And they start to say, well, what are you doing? And so it begins to grow in a more organic way. Still within that building, you need the support, if you will, the alignment of the leadership and the administration to say, yeah, let's give this a shot. But within that context, to force everyone in some ways uses a lot of energy to address the naysayers, rather than going where it's received. You take that energy and you use it to support people who want to move the work forward, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think we should probably wrap it up, but thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.